Kant begins his project by asking what makes knowledge possible in the first place. For him, knowledge is not merely the passive reception of information from the senses. The mind does not sit like an empty container waiting to be filled by the world. Instead, the mind actively shapes experience. What we call knowledge arises from the interplay between what comes to us from outside through sensation and what the mind contributes from within through its own structures and categories. This idea, which Kant called transcendental idealism, insists that we never encounter reality as it is in itself. The world as it truly exists, what he calls the noumenal realm, is forever beyond our grasp. What we actually know is the phenomenal realm, the world as it appears to us, structured by the faculties of human cognition. This distinction between noumena and phenomena is central to all of Kant's work. It explains both the power and the limits of human reason. We can achieve genuine knowledge of appearances, but we cannot transcend the conditions of our own experience to access things as they are in themselves. The senses provide raw data, what Kant calls intuitions. These intuitions by themselves are chaotic and unordered. It is the mind that organizes them into coherent experience. The most basic forms of this ordering are space and time. According to Kant, space and time are not properties of things in themselves, nor are they discovered in the world outside us. They are forms of sensibility, ways in which the human mind structures all experience. Everything we encounter must appear to us in spatial and temporal terms because our mind is built to represent the world in those forms. Without space and time, experience would not be possible at all. But space and time are not enough. In order for intuitions to become knowledge, they must be subsumed under concepts. Kant identifies the pure concepts of the understanding, the categories, as the rules the mind applies to organize intuitions into judgments. These categories include concepts like unity, plurality, causality, necessity, possibility, and so on. They are not learned from experience because they are what make experience possible in the first place. Whenever we see an event, for example, we immediately understand it in terms of cause and effect, because our mind necessarily applies the category of causality. This means that knowledge is possible only through the synthesis of intuitions and concepts. Neither by itself is sufficient. Intuitions without concepts are blind, because they remain raw data without order or meaning. Concepts without intuitions are empty, because they lack content to apply to. Only the cooperation of both produces knowledge. This union is what Kant calls synthetic a priori knowledge, knowledge that is both informed by experience and structured by principles that precede experience. Mathematics and pure natural science are paradigms of this synthetic a priori knowledge. For instance, we can know that every event must have a cause, not because we discover it empirically in each case, but because causality is a necessary condition for experience itself. The law of causality is not read out of the world, but imposed by the mind as the framework through which the world is intelligible. Similarly, geometry is possible because space is the form of our sensibility. Arithmetic is possible because time provides the basis for succession and addition of numbers. By explaining how such knowledge is possible, Kant resolves the conflict between empiricism and rationalism. Empiricists, such as Locke and Hume, argued that all knowledge derives from experience, but they struggled to explain how universal and necessary truths could arise from particular observations. Rationalists, like Descartes and Leibniz, insisted that reason alone can provide such truths, but they risked constructing systems disconnected from empirical reality. Kant's critical philosophy takes what is correct in both traditions while avoiding their shortcomings. He accepts the empiricist point that knowledge requires experience, but he adds that experience itself is only possible because of the a priori structures of the mind as the rationalists intuited. This account of knowledge profoundly changes how we think about the relationship between subject and object. Instead of assuming that knowledge is the mind conforming to objects, Kant argues that objects must conform to the conditions of human cognition. What we call objects are already filtered through the lens of space, time, and the categories. The human mind is not a passive spectator, but an active legislator of nature.
This leads to a deeper insight. Science does not simply discover laws in the world, but articulates the necessary forms through which we experience the world. When physics describes the laws of motion, causality, or conservation, it is not penetrating into the noumenal realm, but making explicit the rules that the mind must apply in order for phenomena to be coherent. Scientific knowledge is real, objective, and universal, but it is bound to the phenomenal realm, never to the things in themselves. Kant also insists on the finitude of human reason. We can never escape the structures of our cognition to know reality as it truly is beyond appearances. The noumenal realm, the thing in itself, remains an unknowable limit. Yet this limit is not a weakness. It is precisely what grounds the possibility of knowledge. By recognizing that knowledge is confined to phenomena, Kant secures its objectivity. We do not need access to things in themselves to have certainty about the phenomenal world, just as we do not need to see the absolute truth to know the conditions under which truth appears to us. This epistemological revolution is why Kant declared that he was effecting a Copernican revolution in philosophy. Just as Copernicus explained the motions of the heavens by placing the sun rather than the earth at the center, Kant explains knowledge by placing the human mind at the center of the conditions of experience. It is not the world that dictates how the mind must be, but the mind that dictates how the world can appear to us. This radical move reshaped all subsequent philosophy. It showed that the path to understanding is not simply outward into the world, but inward into the structures of subjectivity. The human being is both limited and empowered. Limited because we can never know the noumenal. Empowered because we provide the very conditions that make knowledge possible. Kant's theory of knowledge rests upon the insight that space and time are not discovered in the world but supplied by the mind as the necessary forms of sensibility. To experience anything at all, we must represent it as existing somewhere in space and occurring at some moment in time. Space and time are the lenses through which reality is given to us, not features of reality as it exists in itself. When Kant declares that space is the form of outer intuition, he means that everything external to us must appear as extended, located, and ordered spatially. No sensation is intelligible without spatial structure. A sound, a color, a texture, all of these are situated in a spatial field. Even when we imagine something, our imagination places it in some relation of size, distance, or position. Space is therefore not an empirical generalization derived from observing many things. It is the necessary condition for observing anything at all. Time, by contrast, is the form of inner intuition. It structures not what appears outside us, but the succession of our own states. Every experience unfolds temporally. Thoughts, emotions, and sensations all occur in sequence, one after another. Even if nothing external changed, our own consciousness would still present itself as a series of moments. Thus, time is unavoidable in every possible experience. Unlike space, which primarily orders external appearances, time applies to everything because even spatial phenomena are perceived in temporal succession. Space and time are what Kant calls pure intuitions. They are pure because they exist prior to any particular experience and shape all experiences universally. They are intuitions rather than concepts because they represent singular wholes. Space is not an abstract concept that gathers many instances under a common rule. It is an immediate, infinite expanse within which all spatial objects are located. Similarly, time is not a concept derived from observing clocks or cycles, but the immediate medium in which all events occur. This insight explains the possibility of synthetic a priori judgments in mathematics. Geometry is possible because the properties of space are known a priori, since space itself is the form of outer intuition. Arithmetic is possible because time provides the form of succession that grounds the operations of addition and subtraction. When we say that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, we do not rely on empirical observation of every possible case. We know it by reflecting upon the nature of space itself, which is a priori given. But space and time, while necessary, do not suffice to turn experience into knowledge. Intuitions by themselves are manifold, a flood of impressions that need to be unified. This unification is accomplished by the understanding, which provides concepts. Kant distinguishes between empirical concepts, which we derive from experience, and pure concepts of the understanding, which are a priori. The latter are what he calls categories.
The categories are fundamental concepts such as unity, plurality, totality, reality, negation, limitation, substance, causality, reciprocity, possibility, existence, and necessity. They are not derived from the world, but rather provide the framework through which the world is experienced as coherent. To see something as an object, to recognize an event as having a cause, or to grasp something as possible or necessary, presupposes the application of these categories. The categories are organized according to the forms of judgment. Kant analyzes the basic types of judgments we can make, such as universal, particular, singular, affirmative, negative, infinite, categorical, hypothetical, disjunctive, assertoric, problematic, apodictic, and shows how each corresponds to a category. For instance, hypothetical judgments involve the relation of condition and consequence, which corresponds to the category of causality. This structural parallel demonstrates that the categories are not arbitrary, but grounded in the very logic of thought. Yet the categories cannot operate directly on raw intuitions. They require mediation through what Kant calls schemata. A schema is a rule that allows a category to be applied to a temporal intuition. For example, the category of causality is schematized by the rule of succession according to a rule in time. This ensures that the abstract concept of causality can be applied to actual experiences, such as perceiving one event followed by another in lawful order. Schemata thus bridge the gap between pure concepts and sensible intuitions, making objective knowledge possible. Through the synthesis of intuitions and categories, the mind constructs experience. This synthesis is an active process, guided by the unity of apperception, the self-conscious awareness that I think must accompany all my representations. Without this unity, impressions would remain disconnected. It is the self that holds together the manifold of intuition under the categories, transforming sensations into a coherent world. Kant's analysis shows that the necessity and universality of scientific knowledge arise from the mind's contribution. Laws of nature are not mere regularities discovered inductively. They express the necessary forms through which we experience appearances. The law of causality, for instance, is not contingent on repeated observation, but grounded in the a priori structure of the understanding. This explains why science can achieve certainty, unlike empirical generalizations. At the same time, the distinction between phenomena and noumena ensures that this certainty has limits. We can know with necessity how objects must appear to us, but we can never know how things are in themselves. The categories structure phenomena, not noumena. To apply them beyond possible experience would be to misuse them, leading to illusion. This safeguard is essential to Kant's critical project,
preventing reason from overstepping its bounds. The framework of space, time, and categories thus establishes the architecture of human knowledge. Experience is neither a mere imprint of reality on the mind, nor a free construction of reason independent of the world. It is the product of the interplay between sensibility and understanding, grounded in the forms of intuition and the categories of thought. This architecture explains why science is both objective and limited, universal yet tied to the conditions of human cognition. Kant's philosophy of knowledge does not end with the understanding and its categories. He also analyzes reason itself, which he distinguishes from understanding. The understanding applies categories to intuitions, generating experience of objects. Reason, however, seeks unity beyond experience. It drives us to ask ultimate questions. What is the soul? Does the universe have a beginning? Does God exist? These are not matters of immediate experience, but the mind cannot resist raising them. Reason operates through what Kant calls ideas. Unlike concepts which organize experience, ideas point beyond experience to the unconditioned. They seek totality and completeness, where the understanding deals with finite appearances. The three principal ideas of reason correspond to the three domains of metaphysics: the soul, the world as a whole, and God. These give rise to rational psychology, rational cosmology, and rational theology. The problem is that reason, in applying these ideas as if they were objects of knowledge, overreaches its legitimate bounds. When it tries to treat the soul as a thing in itself, or the world as a totality of things in themselves, or God as a supersensible being, it attempts to know what cannot be given in experience. The result is illusion. Kant calls this transcendental illusion, the inevitable tendency of reason to extend the categories beyond phenomena into the noumenal realm.
The most striking examples of this overreach are the antinomies of pure reason. An antinomy is a pair of equally rational but contradictory propositions, both of which reason is compelled to assert when it seeks knowledge beyond possible experience. Kant presents four main antinomies in the Critique of Pure Reason. The first antinomy concerns the finitude or infinitude of the world in time and space. The thesis states that the world has a beginning in time and is limited in space. The antithesis argues that the world is infinite in time and space. Both claims can be supported by reason, yet they contradict one another. The second antinomy concerns the divisibility of matter. The thesis claims that every composite consists of simple parts. The antithesis claims that nothing simple exists and everything is infinitely divisible. Again, both sides seem rational, yet they cannot both be true. The third antinomy concerns causality and freedom. The thesis holds that not everything is determined by natural causes, but freedom is possible. The antithesis asserts that everything occurs according to deterministic laws of nature, leaving no room for freedom. The fourth antinomy concerns the existence of a necessary being. The thesis asserts that such a being must exist as the ground of the contingent world. The antithesis insists that no necessary being exists and everything is contingent. These antinomies reveal the limits of speculative reason. They arise because reason illegitimately applies categories beyond experience, to the totality of the world or to things in themselves. For example, when we ask whether the world as a whole is finite or infinite, we treat it as if it were an object of possible experience, whereas in fact, the world as a totality cannot be given in intuition. The same error underlies all the antinomies. Kant's resolution is to show that both sides of the antinomies are false when applied to noumena, but valid when restricted to phenomena. The world as appearance has no absolute beginning or infinite past. Such questions misapply the categories. Matter as phenomenon can be divided further, but whether it is ultimately simple lies beyond experience. Causality within phenomena is necessary, yet this does not preclude the possibility of freedom in the noumenal sense. And the idea of a necessary being cannot be proven by speculative reason, though it may have a regulative role. The antinomies thus serve an important purpose. They expose the illusions that arise when reason forgets the limits of knowledge. They show that metaphysical disputes that have occupied philosophers for centuries are insoluble, not because they are poorly argued, but because they exceed the bounds of possible experience. At the same time, Kant does not dismiss reason entirely. The ideas of reason, though they cannot constitute knowledge, have a regulative function. They guide the understanding by encouraging us to seek systematic unity. For instance, the idea of the world as a whole motivates science to search for universal laws, even though the totality itself can never be given. The idea of God inspires us to think of nature as if it were ordered by supreme wisdom, which fosters inquiry. The idea of the soul encourages us to study consciousness systematically. In this way, reason provides direction without yielding objects of knowledge. This careful balance, denying speculative knowledge while preserving regulative use, is central to Kant's critical philosophy. He blocks the pretensions of metaphysics to know the absolute, but he also safeguards the legitimacy of science and the practical significance of reason. The mind cannot know the noumenal realm, but it can orient itself through ideas that regulate its activity. The third antinomy, concerning freedom, has special importance because it connects theoretical and practical philosophy. If everything is determined by natural causes, how can human freedom exist? Kant resolves this by distinguishing appearances, which are subject to natural laws, from things in themselves, where freedom is possible. From the standpoint of phenomena, every action is caused. From the standpoint of noumena, we can think of ourselves as free. This opens the door to moral philosophy, where freedom is the condition for responsibility. The antinomies therefore reveal both the limitations and the possibilities of reason. They prevent us from dogmatic metaphysics while preparing the ground for morality and faith. They show that reason is restless, always striving for the unconditioned, but that its proper role is not to deliver knowledge of the noumenal, but to regulate our pursuit of unity within the phenomenal.
By mapping the limits of reason, Kant accomplishes a decisive task. He prevents philosophy from collapsing into skepticism, as Hume threatened, by showing how knowledge of phenomena is possible. He prevents it from lapsing into dogmatism, as rationalist metaphysics attempted, by showing why knowledge of noumena is impossible. And he secures space for morality, faith, and freedom by recognizing that reason points beyond appearances, even if it cannot know what lies there. If the critique of pure reason set the boundaries of theoretical knowledge, the critique of practical reason establishes the grounds of morality. Kant argues that freedom, which could not be proven within speculative reason, finds its reality in the moral law. For him, to act morally is to act freely. To be free is to be bound by reason's own law, not by external causes or desires. Kant begins by distinguishing different kinds of principles that can guide human action. Actions may be performed in accordance with duty or from duty. Only the latter have genuine moral worth. For example, if a shopkeeper gives fair prices because he fears losing customers, his action accords with duty but is motivated by self-interest. If he gives fair prices because it is his duty to treat customers honestly, his action has moral worth. The key is the motive. Morality lies not in consequences, but in the intention guided by reason. This leads Kant to distinguish hypothetical and categorical imperatives. A hypothetical imperative has the form, if you want X, then you ought to do Y. Its force depends on contingent desires. If you do not want X, the imperative does not bind you. For instance, if you want to be healthy, you should exercise. Such imperatives are conditional and limited. A categorical imperative, by contrast, commands absolutely, without reference to any particular ends. It is the expression of pure reason's demand. You ought to do Y, regardless of what you desire. This is the form of moral law. It binds universally, for all rational beings in all circumstances. Kant formulates the categorical imperative in several ways, each highlighting a different aspect of moral law, but ultimately equivalent. The first formulation is the formula of universal law. Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. This requires testing one's maxims by imagining them as universal rules. If a maxim cannot be consistently universalized, it is immoral. Take the example of a false promise. Suppose one considers borrowing money with no intention to repay it. The maxim would be, whenever I need money, I may make a false promise. Universalized, this would destroy the very institution of promising, since no one would trust promises. Thus, the maxim is self-contradictory when universalized, and therefore immoral. The second formulation is the formula of humanity. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end and never merely as a means. This emphasizes respect for rational beings as ends in themselves. To use someone merely as a means, by lying, coercing, or exploiting, denies their dignity. To act morally is to recognize the intrinsic worth of every person as a rational agent. The third formulation is the formula of autonomy. Act only so that your will can regard itself as at the same time making universal law through its maxim. This stresses that moral law is not imposed from outside, but arises from the rational will itself. To be free is to legislate the moral law for oneself as a member of a kingdom of ends, a community of rational beings bound by shared laws of reason. Through these formulations, Kant grounds morality in pure reason, independent of contingent desires or external authorities. Moral obligation is not derived from happiness, utility, or divine command, but from the structure of rational agency itself. The authority of the moral law comes from the fact that to be rational is to act according to universalizable principles, to respect humanity as an end, and to legislate autonomously. This conception of morality has several radical implications. First, it places the individual rational agent at the center of ethics. Every person, by virtue of rationality, is a legislator of the moral law. This underpins Kant's profound commitment to human dignity and equality. No one is exempt, and no one is subordinate to another's arbitrary will. Second, it means that consequences are not the measure of morality. A good will is good not because of what it accomplishes, but because of its commitment to duty. Even if one's efforts fail, the moral worth remains intact. This contrasts sharply with utilitarian ethics, which judge actions by their outcomes. For Kant, morality is not about maximizing happiness, but about respecting the law of reason.
Third, it means that freedom is not licensed to do whatever one desires. True freedom is autonomy, self-legislation in accordance with reason. To obey inclinations or impulses is to be a slave to heteronomy, ruled by something external. To obey the moral law is to be genuinely free, because one is acting according to principles that one gives oneself as a rational being. Kant illustrates these ideas with examples. Suicide, he argues, fails the test of universal law, for a maxim of self-destruction contradicts the natural drive to preserve life and undermines the basis of moral agency. False promises, as we saw, undermine trust. Neglecting one's talents violates the duty to develop one's capacities, since universalizing idleness would contradict reason's aim for self-perfection. Indifference to others' suffering fails the demand of humanity, for it treats others as if their well-being were of no value. The categorical imperative also explains why moral duties are unconditional. They are not based on achieving happiness, which varies among individuals, nor on producing good consequences, which are uncertain. They are rooted in the very structure of rational willing. This makes them binding regardless of personal inclinations or circumstances. Some critics find Kant's rigorism daunting. His view seems to demand strict adherence to duty, leaving little room for exceptions or compromises. Others argue that the categorical imperative is too formal, that it does not provide substantive guidance for complex moral dilemmas. Yet Kant would respond that the point is not to supply ready-made rules for every situation, but to provide a test for the rationality of maxims. It is the responsibility of each agent to apply reason sincerely. The centrality of the categorical imperative reveals why morality and freedom are inseparable. To follow duty is not to submit to an alien command, but to affirm one's rational nature. Moral law is the expression of our autonomy. By acting from duty, we are not constrained, but liberated from the tyranny of impulses and external influences. This union of morality and freedom also points toward the ultimate ends of practical reason, the highest good where virtue and happiness are harmonized. For Kant, this harmony is not fully realizable in the empirical world, but it is the object of moral striving. It requires postulates of practical reason, such as the immortality of the soul and the existence of God, which ground the possibility of the highest good. Thus, from the recognition of the moral law arises not only a philosophy of duty, but also a vision of freedom, dignity, and purpose. The categorical imperative is not a dry formula, but a principle that affirms the worth of every person and the capacity of human beings to govern themselves through reason. It is the keystone of Kant's practical philosophy, linking autonomy, universality, and the dignity of humanity. The heart of Kant's moral philosophy lies in the idea of autonomy. To understand autonomy, one must see that it is not the absence of constraints, nor is it the pursuit of whatever one desires in the moment. Autonomy is the capacity of the rational will to give itself the law independent of external influences. In Kant's words, it is the property of the will by which it is a law to itself. This stands in opposition to heteronomy, where the will is determined by something outside itself, such as desires, inclinations, or commands from others. Kant's claim is striking. To be moral is to be free, and to be free is to be moral. At first, this sounds paradoxical. We often think of freedom as doing what we want. But for Kant, if we act only on impulses, we are enslaved by them. Our choices are dictated by forces outside reason. Genuine freedom arises when we act not according to passing desires, but according to principles we can rationally will as universal laws. In this way, autonomy is not constraint, but the highest form of self-determination. This idea leads Kant to his image of the kingdom of ends.
Imagine a moral community in which every rational being is both a legislator and a subject of the universal law. Each person acts according to maxims that could be universalized, and in doing so, each recognizes every other rational being as an end in themselves. No one is reduced to a mere instrument for another's purpose. Each stands in dignity, and all are bound together by the shared law of reason. The kingdom of ends is not merely an abstract vision. It has practical significance for how we treat others. When I consider lying to someone, I am using them merely as a means to achieve my goal. I disregard their capacity as a rational agent to make informed choices. To respect their dignity, I must act in a way that recognizes their worth as an end. The principle is not to manipulate or dominate others, but to engage with them as free beings who are also authors of moral law.
Kant's vision of freedom contrasts sharply with other traditions. In classical philosophy, freedom was often associated with self-mastery, but also with the pursuit of happiness or flourishing, eudaimonia. In modern thought, freedom was often understood in terms of rights or absence of interference. Kant's autonomy goes deeper. It is the inner structure of the will itself. It is not freedom from law, but freedom through law, the law we give ourselves as rational beings. This conception also provides a foundation for human dignity. Because every rational being is autonomous, every rational being deserves unconditional respect. Dignity, unlike price, cannot be measured or exchanged. To violate another's autonomy, to coerce, deceive, or exploit them, is to deny their status as an end. The categorical imperative thus establishes the moral equality of persons and underpins the idea of human rights. Kant also distinguishes between the world of appearances and the world of things in themselves, which he calls the phenomenal and noumenal realms. In the phenomenal realm, we are subject to causal laws of nature, determined by prior events. In the noumenal realm, we are free as rational beings, legislating moral law. Our freedom cannot be proven empirically, but it is presupposed by the very fact of moral obligation. If we are bound by duty, then we must be capable of acting freely according to it. This dual perspective explains how Kant reconciles determinism in nature with freedom in morality. As empirical beings, we are part of the causal order. As rational beings, we belong to the noumenal realm, where freedom reigns. The moral law reveals this freedom. The fact that we experience ourselves as obligated shows that we are not wholly determined by nature. Thus, autonomy is both a fact of reason and the ground of moral responsibility. The kingdom of ends also illuminates the social dimension of Kant's philosophy. Morality is not a solitary enterprise, but a shared order of rational beings. Each of us acts not only for ourselves, but as a member of a community bound by universal law. In this sense, Kant anticipates ideas of cosmopolitanism and universal rights. The moral law applies to all rational beings, regardless of culture, status, or circumstance. To respect the autonomy of one is to affirm the autonomy of all. This vision is demanding. It requires us to rise above our immediate desires and to act from principles that could be laws for everyone. It demands that we treat others not as tools, but as equals in dignity. It calls us to see ourselves not as isolated individuals, but as citizens of a moral commonwealth, the kingdom of ends. Yet in this demanding vision lies a profound sense of freedom and respect. It shows that morality is not an external burden, but the deepest expression of our rational nature. For Kant, the unity of autonomy, freedom, and the kingdom of ends is the pinnacle of moral philosophy. It grounds ethics not in outcomes,
not in divine command, not in cultural norms, but in the very structure of reason itself. It is both universal and personal, demanding and liberating, rigorous and dignifying. It is a call to live as rational beings who respect ourselves and others as authors of moral law, united in a community of ends. Kant's moral philosophy reaches its most distinctive form in his analysis of duty. For him, morality is not about achieving happiness, maximizing pleasure, or pursuing desirable consequences. It is about acting out of duty, doing what is right because it is right, not because it brings benefit or reward. This emphasis distinguishes Kant from consequentialists like utilitarians, and even from virtue ethicists of the Aristotelian tradition. Duty is the necessity of an action from respect for the moral law. Respect here is not admiration or affection, but recognition of the authority of reason itself. When I act from duty, I subordinate my inclinations to the moral law that reason prescribes. If I help someone because it pleases me or enhances my reputation, my action may conform to duty, but lacks genuine moral value. Only when I recognize that it is my duty to treat others as ends in themselves does my action have true moral value. This distinction clarifies Kant's famous insistence that the good will is the only thing good without qualification. Talents, virtues, or even happiness can be misused if they are not guided by the good will. The good will is good not because of what it achieves, but because of its intention, its unwavering commitment to duty for its own sake. This uncompromising stance sometimes makes Kant seem rigid, but it reflects his conviction that morality must rest on principles that are universal and unconditional, not on shifting outcomes or preferences.
Virtue, for Kant, is the strength of will to act according to duty despite contrary inclinations. It is not merely the possession of good traits or habits, but the cultivated capacity to resist temptation and uphold the moral law. Virtue involves self-mastery, but unlike classical virtue ethics, Kant does not base it on the pursuit of happiness or flourishing. Instead, virtue expresses the autonomy of the rational will. It is the manifestation of our freedom to follow reason rather than inclination. Kant recognizes that morality cannot be divorced from the question of the highest good, the ultimate end of practical reason. The highest good, as he defines it, is the union of virtue and happiness. Virtue is the condition of being worthy of happiness, while happiness is the satisfaction of rational beings' natural desires. Ideally, the two would coincide. The virtuous would be happy, and happiness would be proportionate to moral worth. But in our world, virtue and happiness often diverge. The righteous suffer, the wicked prosper. This divergence presents a profound problem. If morality requires us to pursue the highest good, yet the highest good is unattainable in this life, how can reason demand it? Kant resolves this by introducing postulates of practical reason, the immortality of the soul, and the existence of God. These are not theoretical proofs, but practical necessities. Immortality ensures that the moral striving toward virtue can extend beyond finite life. God guarantees the harmony of virtue and happiness, ensuring that the highest good is possible. It is important to note that for Kant, these postulates are not speculative claims about metaphysics, but moral necessities. We cannot prove God exists, but if we are to make sense of the demand to realize the highest good, we must assume a moral order in which this harmony is possible. Faith here is not irrational. It is the rational commitment of the practical will to the conditions under which morality can be fulfilled. The highest good also connects individual morality to a broader vision of human destiny.
Morality is not only about individual actions, but about the progress of humanity toward a moral world. Each active duty contributes to this collective project, even if imperfectly realized. The highest good thus unites personal virtue with a cosmopolitan hope, a world in which rational beings live in accordance with moral law and are proportionately happy. In this way, Kant unites the stern voice of moral law with the deep aspiration for human fulfillment, grounding ethics not only in obligation, but in the ultimate harmony of virtue and happiness. Kant's moral philosophy naturally extends into questions of religion, but he approaches religion in a radically different way than traditional theology. For him, religion is not first and foremost about dogma, rituals, or external authority. Religion becomes meaningful only insofar as it expresses and supports the moral law. His famous formulation is that religion is the recognition of all duties as divine commands. This does not mean that morality is derived from God, but that we can regard moral obligation as if it were the command of a divine legislator. In this sense, morality is prior to religion. We do not need religious belief in order to know our duties. Reason alone is sufficient. However, religion can play a role in fortifying moral life by giving symbolic expression to the moral law and by providing hope in the realization of the highest good. Thus, Kant insists that true religion must always be within the limits of reason alone. Any claim that contradicts moral reason, whether miracles, dogmas, or arbitrary commands, must be rejected as superstition or fanaticism. This perspective allows Kant to reinterpret many traditional religious concepts in moral terms. For example, the idea of original sin is not for him a literal inheritance of guilt from Adam, but a symbolic way of describing the radical propensity in human beings to prioritize inclination over moral law. We all have a tendency to subordinate duty to self-interest, and this is the true meaning of radical evil. Yet this evil is not metaphysical or insurmountable. It can be overcome through the moral effort to subordinate inclination to reason.
Similarly, the concept of salvation is reinterpreted as the moral transformation of the will. Redemption does not consist in divine intervention or the imputation of righteousness by faith alone. It consists in the gradual process by which the individual commits themselves to the moral law, reshaping their maxims and striving to become virtuous. This moral renewal is not instantaneous, but a lifelong task, always imperfect, yet always directed toward the ideal of holiness. Kant also redefines the role of the church. A true church is not an institution wielding external authority, but a moral community of believers who support one another in striving toward virtue. Its purpose is not to enforce doctrine, but to cultivate ethical life. Thus, religious symbols, rituals, and stories may have pedagogical value, but only insofar as they point back to moral duty. Any attempt to substitute ritual observance for moral commitment is a distortion of religion. The figure of Christ, for Kant, can be interpreted as the ideal of moral perfection made visible. Whether or not Christ literally performed miracles is irrelevant. What matters is that he represents the archetype of the good will, a symbol of the human capacity to embody the moral law fully. In this way, Christ functions as a moral example rather than a supernatural savior. By grounding religion in morality, Kant avoids both dogmatism and nihilism. He does not deny religion altogether, but he subjects it to the tribunal of reason. Religion must be rational, moral, and universal. It cannot demand blind obedience or contradict the autonomy of the will. At the same time, religion can nourish the moral life by sustaining hope, by offering symbols of moral ideals, and by fostering a community of moral striving. This reorientation had profound implications.
It undermined the authority of ecclesiastical institutions while elevating the authority of reason. It made morality independent of theology, yet it gave religion a new dignity as the symbolic expression of moral truth. It opened the way for a conception of faith that is compatible with enlightenment and universal human dignity. In essence, Kant's religion within the limits of reason alone reveals a deep continuity with his entire philosophy. Morality is grounded in autonomy and reason, not in external authority. Religion is valuable only when it supports this moral autonomy, and dangerous when it undermines it. This vision preserves the moral depth of religion while liberating it from superstition and arbitrary command, showing that true faith is nothing other than the recognition of duty as divine in its authority. Kant's political philosophy flows directly from his moral philosophy. If morality is about autonomy and respect for rational beings as ends in themselves, then politics must be about creating structures that protect and enable this autonomy in the social sphere. For Kant, the purpose of political order is not to maximize happiness, wealth, or power, but to secure the conditions under which each individual's freedom can coexist with the freedom of all others under a system of universal law. Freedom here is not license, but independence from being subject to another's arbitrary will. A just society is one where laws are established that enable each person to exercise their freedom without infringing upon the freedom of others. This requires a legal and political order in which coercion is legitimate only when it preserves the possibility of equal freedom for everyone. Thus, Kant develops a vision of the state as a moral community governed by the rule of law, not by the whims of rulers or the accidents of power. A republican constitution is the political arrangement most consistent with these principles. By republicanism, he means not simply representative government, but a system based on the separation of powers, the rule of law, and the participation of citizens in legislation. A republic ensures that laws are grounded in the general will of rational beings, rather than imposed by a despotic ruler. It institutionalizes the autonomy of citizens by giving them a voice in the laws to which they are subject. The social contract for Kant is not a historical event, but a rational idea. It is the principle that legitimate laws must be such that all citizens could consent to them as free and equal beings. The state derives its authority not from tradition, conquest, or divine right, but from the rational will of its citizens as a collective. This conception of political legitimacy reflects Kant's deeper commitment to autonomy and universal law. Just as morality is self-legislation, so political legitimacy arises from the self-legislation of the people as a whole.
Kant also extends his philosophy to the international sphere in his vision of perpetual peace. In his essay of that name, he argues that lasting peace is not a utopian dream, but a rational necessity. Wars arise from despotic governments, from standing armies, and from the absence of a legal framework among states. To overcome this, Kant proposes that states must be republican, that they must form a federation of free states governed by laws rather than force, and that they must respect the rights of individuals as world citizens. The idea of perpetual peace rests on the same principles as his moral and political philosophy: respect for autonomy, the universality of moral law, and the necessity of lawful order. Just as individuals cannot be secure in their freedom without laws, states cannot be secure without a lawful framework binding them together. The federation Kant envisions is not a global superstate, but a league of states committed to resolving disputes through law rather than war. Kant's principle of cosmopolitan right further extends this vision.
He argues that individuals, as rational beings, are not merely members of particular states, but citizens of the world. They possess rights not only as members of a nation, but as members of humanity. This underlies his defense of the right to hospitality, the idea that foreigners have a claim to respectful treatment when they arrive on another's soil. In an interconnected world, respect for human dignity cannot stop at national borders. Critics often point out that Kant's vision is highly idealized, and indeed he acknowledges that achieving perpetual peace may take centuries of gradual progress. Yet he insists that it is not optional. Reason demands it, for only a lawful federation of free states can secure the conditions under which freedom and dignity are universally respected. The moral law within each person thus projects itself outward into a political vision of universal justice. In his political thought, Kant unites rigor with hope. He recognizes the constraints of human selfishness and the persistence of conflict, yet he insists that reason requires us to strive toward a lawful order both within and among states. The Republican state and the Federation of Free States are the political embodiment of the kingdom of ends, where rational beings live not under arbitrary power, but under laws they could all will as free and equal members of a moral community. Kant's philosophy of aesthetics, developed most fully in the Critique of Judgment, occupies a unique place in his system. After exploring the conditions of knowledge in the Critique of Pure Reason and the conditions of morality in the Critique of Practical Reason, he turned to the conditions of judgment itself, especially in the realm of beauty and sublimity. This third critique seeks to bridge the gap between nature and freedom, between the deterministic world of natural science and the moral world of autonomy. The experience of beauty is, for Kant, a disinterested pleasure. When we find something beautiful, we do not desire to possess it, use it, or consume it. Instead, we delight in its mere appearance. Beauty is the form of purposiveness without the representation of a purpose. A flower, for example, strikes us as beautiful not because it serves any function for us, but because its form seems perfectly ordered and harmonious in itself. We sense a kind of purposiveness, as though it were designed for our contemplation, but without being able to assign any specific purpose. This disinterestedness distinguishes aesthetic judgment both from sensory pleasure and moral approval. Sensory pleasure arises from desire and consumption, while moral approval arises from respect for law. Aesthetic pleasure, in contrast, is free, universal, and contemplative. When we judge something to be beautiful, we implicitly claim that others ought to share our judgment, even though it is not based on concepts or rules. This universality without concepts is one of the mysteries of aesthetic judgment. It is subjective, yet carries a claim to universality.
Beyond beauty, Kant also analyzes the sublime, which he distinguishes from the beautiful. The sublime arises not from harmonious form, but from formlessness, from the overwhelming magnitude or power of nature. A storm, a towering mountain, or the starry heavens can strike us with a feeling of sublimity. In such experiences, imagination fails to grasp the vastness or power before us, yet reason asserts its superiority. We feel small as natural beings, yet simultaneously exalted as rational beings who can conceive of infinity or moral strength. Thus, the sublime humbles us as sensible creatures while elevating us as moral beings. It reveals the inadequacy of our finite faculties, but also the boundlessness of our rational and moral vocation. Where beauty delights in harmony, the sublime challenges us with disproportion. But in both cases, we experience the free play of faculties that points beyond the empirical world. Kant also extends his analysis to art. Works of fine art differ from mere natural beauty in that they are products of human genius. Genius is the capacity to produce works that are exemplary without being reducible to rules. A true artist creates in a way that cannot be fully explained by technique or imitation. Their work serves as a standard for others, yet it arises from a kind of inspired originality. Art, then, is purposiveness without purpose, given form by human creativity. Importantly, for Kant, art is not about moral instruction or practical function, but about the free communication of aesthetic ideas. An aesthetic idea is a representation that stimulates more thought than can be captured in a determinate concept. Great art awakens the imagination and reason, hinting at ideas of freedom, of infinity, of morality that cannot be fully articulated. Thus, art becomes a symbol of the moral world, not by preaching morality, but by manifesting the harmony of freedom and nature. The critique of judgment thus performs a crucial mediating role in Kant's system. By analyzing aesthetic experience, Kant shows how our faculties can operate in freedom and harmony, anticipating both the determinacy of science and the freedom of morality. Beauty symbolizes morality by presenting freedom in appearance, while the sublime symbolizes our moral destiny by revealing reason's superiority over nature. In this way, Kant weaves aesthetics into his larger philosophical project. The experience of beauty and sublimity is not merely about taste or art, it reflects the deepest capacities of reason and imagination, pointing toward the unity of nature and freedom. Aesthetics becomes the bridge between the descriptive order of science and the prescriptive order of morality, offering us a glimpse of the kingdom of ends not through concepts or laws, but through feeling and imagination. Kant's reflections on religion are an extension of his critical philosophy. He sought neither to defend traditional dogmas nor to reject religion outright, but to reinterpret it within the limits of reason. For him, religion must be purified from superstition and grounded in morality. Faith, when properly understood, is not blind belief in doctrines, but the rational recognition of the moral law as the highest guide of life. Central to Kant's view is the distinction between historical religion and rational religion. Historical religion is tied to particular events, scriptures, rituals, and institutions. These may have cultural and pedagogical value, but they are not the essence of religion. Rational religion, on the other hand, is the recognition of our moral duties as divine commands. True religion is morality seen as if commanded by God. Thus, the heart of religion is ethical. To act morally is to serve God, and to fail morally is to fall into sin. This leads to Kant's critique of ecclesiastical faith. Churches and priests, in his view, often obscure the true essence of religion by substituting ritual observance for moral integrity. Ceremonies, sacraments, and dogmatic disputes may distract people from the core duty of moral self-improvement. While Kant did not reject churches outright, he insisted that their legitimacy depends on whether they promote moral progress. Religion should be a vehicle for cultivating virtue, not for enforcing superstition. Kant also addressed the problem of radical evil. He argued that human beings are not merely occasionally immoral, but have a deep-seated propensity to prioritize self-love over the moral law. This radical evil does not mean humans are incapable of goodness, but it does mean that moral transformation requires a kind of inner revolution. One must freely choose to subordinate self-interest to the moral law, a choice that Kant described as a moral conversion.
Here, the idea of grace takes on a rational reinterpretation. While traditional theology speaks of divine grace as God's intervention in the soul, Kant frames it as the recognition that moral renewal is always possible despite our inclinations. We must act as if divine assistance enables us to strive toward holiness, even though such holiness can never be fully achieved in this life. The moral law obliges us to infinite progress, and faith sustains our commitment to this endless task. Kant's philosophy of religion also connects with his earlier moral postulates: the existence of God, the immortality of the soul, and the freedom of the will. These are not theoretical proofs, but practical necessities. Morality requires us to believe in freedom, for without it, responsibility is meaningless. It also points us toward immortality, since the moral law demands endless progress toward perfection, which cannot be realized in a finite lifetime. Finally, it implies the existence of God as the guarantor of harmony between virtue and happiness, a harmony that cannot be guaranteed in the empirical world. Thus, Kantian faith is not speculative but practical. It is not a matter of proving divine existence through metaphysical arguments, but of acknowledging that the moral life makes sense only under these postulates. God, freedom, and immortality are the conditions under which moral striving is rational. Faith, then, is moral trust in the ultimate coherence of reason, not dogmatic assent to mysteries. Kant's religious thought also sheds light on his vision of history. He believed humanity progresses slowly toward a moral community, a kingdom of God on earth, in which moral principles govern social life. Religion, rightly understood, inspires this progress by reminding us of our moral vocation and by uniting us under the idea of a common moral law. False religion, in contrast, breeds division, fanaticism, and passivity. True religion is a universal ethical faith, transcending sects and dogmas. This reorientation of religion from dogma to morality was controversial in Kant's time. His religion within the limits of reason alone was censored and attacked for undermining church authority. Yet his vision was profoundly modern. Religion should not contradict reason, but should elevate moral life. God is not a being to be proved or described, but the necessary idea that sustains our commitment to virtue. In this way, Kant preserved religion by reforming it, grounding faith not in authority or tradition, but in reason and moral autonomy. Kant's reflections on history are inseparable from his moral philosophy. He believed history has meaning, not as a predetermined script, but as a rational process in which humanity gradually develops its capacities. While the actions of individuals often appear chaotic, selfish, and destructive, when viewed from a broader perspective, history reveals a slow but persistent progress toward moral and political maturity. At the center of Kant's philosophy of history is the idea that nature has a hidden plan. Human beings, driven by their unsocial sociability, the tension between our need for community and our desire for independence, are compelled to develop institutions that secure peace and justice. Conflict, competition, and ambition, though destructive at times, also stimulate culture, science, and law. Thus, even the darker aspects of human behavior can serve the larger purpose of advancing civilization. Kant believed that this progress culminates in the establishment of a cosmopolitan order. In his essay, Idea for a Universal History with a Cosmopolitan Purpose, he argued that the final aim of history is a federation of free republics, bound by law, that secure perpetual peace. This is not utopian fantasy, but a rational demand. If humanity is to survive its destructive tendencies, it must move toward lawful cooperation among nations. The horrors of war, paradoxically, are part of the mechanism pushing states toward this higher goal. Progress, however, is not inevitable in a mechanical sense. It depends on the choices of free individuals and nations. Yet Kant insisted that we can reasonably hope for progress because reason is not merely a private faculty, but
but a collective one. Each generation contributes to the cultural inheritance of humanity, expanding freedom, knowledge, and moral consciousness. Even if individuals act from selfish motives, the long arc of history bends toward enlightenment.
Enlightenment itself is a key theme for Kant. In his famous essay, What is Enlightenment?, he defined it as the courage to use one's own reason without the guidance of another. Enlightenment is humanity's emergence from self-imposed immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to think for oneself, not because of lack of understanding, but because of cowardice and laziness. Religious authorities, political rulers, and social conventions exploit this immaturity, offering ready-made rules and doctrines. But true enlightenment requires individuals to think freely, critically, and responsibly. This does not mean reckless rebellion, but a gradual transformation of culture. Kant distinguished between the private and public uses of reason. In one's private role, such as a soldier or a tax official, obedience to laws and orders may be necessary for stability. But in one's public role, as a scholar, citizen, or writer, reason must be free to critique, question, and explore. It is this freedom of public reason that allows enlightenment to spread. Once people learn to think for themselves, progress in society becomes irreversible. Kant also saw history as moral education. The struggles of nations, the failures of empires, and the revolutions of peoples are not meaningless tragedies, but lessons for humanity. They expose the dangers of tyranny, the necessity of justice, and the potential for freedom. Even when revolutions fail or wars devastate, they reveal the human drive for liberty and equality. History, in this sense, is a laboratory in which reason learns through trial and error. Importantly, Kant's view of progress is not about material prosperity or technological advancement alone. These are valuable, but they are not the true measure of progress. Genuine progress lies in moral development, the growth of respect for human dignity, the expansion of freedom, and the establishment of laws that reflect justice. A society with great wealth but little moral integrity is not truly advanced. Progress is measured by whether humanity is moving closer to a just and peaceful global order. For Kant, hope is a rational duty. Though history is filled with violence and suffering, reason compels us to see in it a trajectory toward improvement. This hope is not naive optimism, but a moral stance. To despair of progress is to abandon the moral project itself. To hope, by contrast, is to commit oneself to working toward a better future, even in the face of setbacks. Thus, Kant's philosophy of history is both descriptive and prescriptive. It describes the mechanisms by which conflict and ambition drive development, but it also prescribes the moral obligation to contribute to enlightenment and peace. Each person is part of this larger story, and each act of reasoned thought or moral courage adds to the slow unfolding of humanity's potential. Kant's critique of judgment addresses the realm of aesthetics, where beauty, art, and the sublime reveal a new dimension of human reason. Unlike theoretical knowledge or moral obligation, aesthetic judgment operates in a space of freedom and play. It bridges the gap between nature and freedom, showing how human beings experience meaning in ways that are neither purely cognitive nor strictly practical, but deeply significant. Kant defines beauty as that which pleases universally without a concept. When we judge something to be beautiful, a flower, a painting, or a melody, we are not simply reporting a private feeling of pleasure. We speak as though others ought to agree with us. Yet this judgment is not based on determinate concepts, like, this is beautiful because it is symmetrical.
It arises from the free harmony of imagination and understanding. Our faculties resonate with the form of the object in such a way that we experience pleasure in its presentation, and this pleasure feels universally communicable. This universality without concept is what makes beauty special. It is subjective because it is a feeling of pleasure, but it claims objectivity because we expect others to share it. Beauty thus points to a shared human sensibility, a common ground of reason that transcends cultural or personal differences. For Kant, this aesthetic universality hints at the possibility of moral universality as well. The delight in beauty prepares the mind for moral ideas by showing us that our subjective faculties can align with something universally valid.
For Kant, great art communicates something inexhaustible. A poem, a painting, or a piece of music does not merely illustrate a concept, but opens a horizon of thought and feeling. It stirs the imagination to grasp meanings that cannot be fully articulated. This is why art has an elevating power. It connects the finite human mind to ideas of reason, such as freedom, justice, or immortality, without reducing them to abstract formulas. Alongside beauty, Kant explores the sublime, which he distinguishes into the mathematical and the dynamical. The mathematical sublime arises when the mind confronts magnitudes so vast that they exceed imagination's capacity to comprehend them. The starry heavens, infinite space, or the boundless ocean. The imagination falters, but reason asserts its supremacy by grasping the idea of infinity. In this moment, we become aware of the superiority of reason over nature, realizing that the mind contains a power greater than sensory representation. The dynamical sublime, by contrast, occurs when we encounter overwhelming natural forces, thunderstorms, volcanoes, or towering mountains. These powers threaten us, yet from a position of safety, we feel a strange mixture of fear and elevation. We recognize that although nature can destroy us physically, it cannot dominate our moral freedom. The experience of the sublime thus awakens awareness of our dignity as rational beings, superior in principle to the forces of nature. Aesthetics, then, is not mere ornament in Kant's system. It is the domain where the human faculties interact in a free and meaningful way, preparing the mind for morality and revealing the power of reason in relation to the infinite. Beauty gives us a foretaste of moral harmony. The sublime gives us an intimation of moral strength. Both show that human experience is more than utility or knowledge. It is the cultivation of sensibility in relation to universal and transcendent ideas. Kant's philosophy of aesthetics transformed the understanding of art and beauty. He demonstrated that aesthetic judgment is not reducible to subjective taste nor to objective science. It occupies its own space, mediating between nature and freedom, sense and reason, feeling and universality. Art and beauty thus reveal the depth of human reason, not by producing knowledge or law, but by showing how our faculties can play in freedom while still resonating with universality. This vision explains why aesthetics is central to culture. Through art, humanity explores ideas that transcend empirical reality, embodying freedom, meaning, and hope in forms that speak to the imagination. Through beauty, we glimpse the possibility of harmony between the finite and the infinite. Through the sublime, we feel the power of reason within us, greater than any natural force. In this way, Kant's aesthetics complements his moral and theoretical philosophy, rounding out the full picture of human reason. Kant's philosophy is not a set of disconnected insights, but a unified project, with each critique illuminating a different dimension of human reason. To understand the depth of his thought, one must see how theoretical reason, practical reason, and judgment form a coherent whole. Each critique addresses a fundamental question: what can I know? What should I do? What may I hope? Together, they form the architecture of reason itself. The critique of pure reason explores the limits and possibilities of human knowledge. It shows that knowledge is possible only through the synthesis of sensibility and understanding, structured by categories and forms of intuition. Yet reason, when it tries to go beyond experience, falls into antinomies and illusions. Theoretical reason thus teaches us humility, showing us the boundaries of knowledge while securing the certainty of science. The critique of practical reason shifts the focus to action. Here, reason is limited not by experience, but commands unconditionally. The moral law reveals human freedom, not as a speculative doctrine, but as a practical necessity. The categorical imperative binds us to universal maxims, grounding the dignity of persons and the autonomy of the will. In the moral domain, reason discovers its true vocation, not to contemplate the world, but to guide conduct according to principles that can be willed universally. The critique of judgment provides the crucial bridge between these two realms. It shows how our faculties of imagination and understanding can harmonize in aesthetic experience, preparing the mind for moral ideas. It also reveals how teleological judgment allows us to interpret nature as if it were purposive, giving coherence to our scientific and moral outlook. This mediation ensures that the split between nature and freedom is not absolute, but bridged in human experience.
Seen as a whole, Kant's system reflects the structure of reason itself: knowledge, morality, and meaning. Knowledge gives us laws of nature, morality gives us laws of freedom, and judgment gives us the sense of unity between them. The unity lies not in collapsing these domains into one, but in respecting their distinctiveness while showing their interconnectedness. Kant's guiding idea is autonomy. In knowing, the mind does not passively receive reality, but actively structures it. In morality, the will does not follow external commands, but legislates laws for itself. In aesthetics, the faculties do not obey determinate rules, but find free harmony. In every domain, reason is not subordinate, but self-legislating. The dignity of humanity lies in this autonomy, the capacity to give law to itself. This unity also extends to Kant's view of religion, politics, and history. Religion becomes meaningful when it expresses moral autonomy. Politics reaches its highest form when it respects the autonomy of citizens and nations. History itself is the gradual realization of autonomy, both individually and collectively. Everywhere, autonomy is the central theme, the capacity of human beings to act and think according to principles of their own reason. Kant's system is therefore not an abstract construction, but a philosophy of human dignity. It demonstrates that reason has limits, but within those limits, it has infinite depth. It shows that freedom is not an illusion, but the very ground of morality. It reveals that beauty and the sublime prepare us for the moral vocation, and it points toward the hope that humanity, through reason, can progress toward peace and justice. To grasp the unity of Kant's system is to see philosophy itself as the self-reflection of reason. Philosophy does not provide dogmatic knowledge of things in themselves, nor does it dictate morality from above. It articulates what reason already demands: knowledge structured by categories, morality grounded in autonomy, beauty that resonates universally, history oriented toward progress. The unity of Kant's thought lies in this profound insight that human reason, in all its dimensions, is both limited and free, finite and yet oriented toward the infinite. The impact of Kant's philosophy cannot be overstated. His critical project reshaped nearly every domain of thought, setting the terms for debates that continued to this day. To trace his legacy is to follow the development of modern philosophy itself, as nearly all subsequent thinkers defined their positions in relation to his work. In metaphysics and epistemology, Kant's transcendental idealism revolutionized the way philosophers understood the relation between mind and world. By arguing that knowledge depends on the categories of understanding and the forms of intuition, he overturned both dogmatic rationalism and crude empiricism. The world of experience is not a mere copy of reality, but the structured result of the interaction between sensibility and reason. This insight became the foundation for German idealism, as Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel sought to expand or overcome Kant's framework. Hegel, in particular, criticized Kant's dualism between phenomena and noumena, seeking instead a system in which reason could reconcile itself fully with reality. In ethics, Kant's moral philosophy established a standard of universality and autonomy that continues to shape debates in moral and political theory. His categorical imperative remains one of the most influential formulations of moral obligation, emphasizing the dignity of persons and the requirement to treat individuals as ends rather than means. This principle has informed contemporary discussions of human rights, deontological ethics, and the foundations of law. Even critics of Kantian ethics often define their positions by contrasting them with his emphasis on duty and universality. In political philosophy, Kant's vision of republicanism and cosmopolitanism inspired later liberal and democratic movements. His essay, Perpetual Peace, anticipated many features of modern international institutions, including federations of states, respect for human rights, and the aspiration to a peaceful global order. While he acknowledged the difficulty of achieving such a system, his argument that it is a rational requirement for the survival of humanity continues to resonate. Contemporary discussions of international law and global justice often trace their lineage to Kant's cosmopolitan vision.
In aesthetics, Kant's critique of judgment laid the groundwork for modern theories of art and beauty. His claim that judgments of beauty are both subjective and universally communicable influenced Romanticism, phenomenology, and later analytic aesthetics. The idea of genius, the role of imagination, and the concept of the sublime became central themes for artists and philosophers alike. His framework for understanding art as a mediator between sense and reason continues to shape how we think about creativity and cultural meaning. The influence of Kant also extends into religion and theology. His attempt to ground religion in morality rather than dogma paved the way for liberal theology, emphasizing ethical life over doctrinal orthodoxy. Thinkers such as Schleiermacher, Ritschl, and later existentialists grappled with his reinterpretation of religious concepts. For many, Kant's insistence that religion must be rational provided a foundation for reconciling faith with Enlightenment ideals. Beyond philosophy, Kant's impact reached the sciences and the humanities more broadly. His critical method influenced the development of psychology, anthropology, and even the emerging social sciences. His insistence on the active role of the mind in structuring experience foreshadowed later developments in cognitive science and linguistics. His moral philosophy, with its emphasis on autonomy and dignity, informed legal systems and political movements advocating for human rights. At the same time, Kant's thought has faced persistent criticism. His transcendental idealism was attacked for being too skeptical, too dualistic, or too obscure. His ethics has been criticized for being too formalistic, ignoring the complexities of moral life and the role of emotion.
His political philosophy has been questioned for its abstract universalism, which some argue neglects cultural and historical particularities. Yet these criticisms testify to the vitality of his thought. It is a philosophy that cannot be ignored, even when it is challenged. Kant's legacy is not that of a system to be accepted wholesale, but of a framework that demands response. His critiques set the boundaries of reason, but within those boundaries, he opened vast spaces for exploration. He taught philosophy to reflect on its own limits, to ground its claims in the structure of reason itself, and to take seriously the autonomy of the human being. His influence persists because the questions he raised remain fundamental. What can I know? What should I do? What may I hope? What is man? In this way, Kant's philosophy continues to serve as a touchstone for human self-understanding. Whether in epistemology, ethics, politics, aesthetics, or religion, his thought provides a model of critical reflection, rigorous, humble, and oriented toward the dignity of reason. His legacy is the ongoing project of enlightenment itself, the effort of humanity to emerge from immaturity by daring to think for itself. Kant's system was also profoundly shaped by his reflections on the limits of human knowledge. In the Critique of Pure Reason, he insisted that while we can know appearances, phenomena, we cannot directly know things in themselves, noumena. This distinction established a boundary. Reason can structure experience, but it cannot penetrate to ultimate reality. Yet this limit was not a weakness, but a condition for freedom, because it opened a space for moral faith. If the noumenal is unknowable, then our moral postulates, God, freedom, and immortality, cannot be disproven, and thus they remain legitimate grounds for practical reason. The implications of this are profound. He effectively argued that metaphysics is impossible as theoretical knowledge, but necessary as a moral faith. We cannot prove God's existence through logic or cosmological reasoning, but we can reasonably assume God's existence as a postulate of moral life. Without such postulates, morality would collapse into nihilism or relativism. Thus, he forged a new kind of faith grounded not in dogma, but in the autonomy of reason itself. Equally important is his contribution to the idea of perpetual peace. In his 1795 essay, Kant outlined the conditions for a world without war. He envisioned a federation of free states, bound not by conquest, but by law, where republics would unite under principles of mutual respect. This idea, centuries later, would inspire the League of Nations and the United Nations. Kant's belief in the capacity of reason to create lasting peace remains one of the most idealistic and daring elements of his philosophy.
At the heart of Kant's system lies respect for persons. Unlike thinkers who saw humans as instruments of the state, the church, or economic progress, Kant viewed every rational being as an end in themselves. This principle, revolutionary for its time, became the foundation of modern rights discourse. It underpins arguments against slavery, exploitation, and tyranny, and continues to resonate in contemporary debates about bioethics, human dignity, and global justice. Kant's philosophy also carries a deep paradox. He celebrated the power of reason, yet constantly reminded us of its limits. He believed in universal moral law, yet acknowledged that its application requires judgment, sensitivity, and sometimes compromise. He imagined perpetual peace, yet lived through wars and conflicts that mocked his vision. He exalted human dignity, yet recognized humanity's weakness, selfishness, and tendency toward evil. It is this tension between hope and realism, reason and limitation, that gives his thought its enduring force.